Right now, imagine someone is watching you from the pitch-black shadows of a suffocating jungle, their finger resting on a cold metal trigger. For nearly 30 years, a highly trained soldier lived in those exact shadows, waging a deadly, silent guerrilla war against an enemy that had already ceased to exist. He wasn't just hiding, he was actively hunting, setting traps, and pulling the trigger in the dark. But the most terrifying part of this story isn't how he survived. It is what happened when the world finally tried to drag him out of his nightmare. While the rest of the world rebuilt from World War II, entered the space age, and watched humanity land on the moon, this lone soldier remained locked in a deadly loop of survival, convinced the global war was still raging. He treated family letters as psychological warfare and military search parties as death traps. But what happened next shocked everyone. Because his final confrontation wouldn't involve an army, but a single, unthinkable decision that almost ended in a bloodbath. What dark secret kept him in that jungle for half his life? To understand, we must look at the chilling command that started it all. In December 1944, a young Japanese intelligence officer named Hiroo Onoda stepped onto the beaches of Lubang Island in the Philippines. As Allied forces closed in, Onoda's commander gave him a desperate order that would haunt him for 3 decades. You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens will come back for you. Until then, as long as you have one soldier, you must continue to lead them. Onoda took this as a sacred vow. When Allied troops took the island, Onoda didn't surrender. Instead, he and 3 other soldiers slipped into the suffocating canopy of the jungle and vanished. They waited in silence for the Japanese army's triumphant return. But as months bled into a year, the radio frequencies went dead and the supply ships never arrived. And then, a bizarre object fell from the sky, threatening to shatter their entire reality. In August 1945, Japan officially surrendered, bringing World War II to a final close. Across the globe, millions of soldiers laid down their weapons and wept with relief. But deep inside the humid labyrinth of Lubang, Onoda and his men knew nothing of peace. One afternoon, a shower of leaflets dropped from a passing plane. Onoda picked one up, his heart hammering against his ribs. The paper boldly declared that the war had ended and ordered them to surrender. But the paper felt too cold, too convenient. Onoda pointed out tiny formatting errors, convincing his men it was a clever Allied trap. They made a strict pact to ignore it. To prove the war was over, search parties began dropping personal letters and photos from Onoda's own family. But the strangest part was still coming. Onoda stared at the photos of his mother, but instead of hope, a chilling dread washed over him. He became convinced his family had been captured and were being held at gunpoint to pose for fake photos to lure him into an ambush. And this is where the story becomes unbelievable, because their refusal to surrender turned the peaceful island into a violent, terrifying war zone. Onoda and his men began launching brutal guerrilla raids, burning crops and killing local villagers they believed were enemy spies. Every bullet they fired, they believed, was a blow for the empire. But living in constant paranoia will eventually break even the strongest minds. In 1949, unable to bear the suffocating fear, one of his men slipped away at night and surrendered. The remaining 3 were paralyzed with terror, certain their friend had been captured and was being tortured for their coordinates. The jungle was no longer their shield. It was a cage closing in. By 1954, their luck ran out. During a chaotic skirmish with a local patrol, Onoda's close friend Shimada was shot dead. Onoda and his last remaining ally, Kazuka, dragged themselves deeper into the mountains, bleeding and terrified. Nobody expected what happened next, because their private war was about to stretch on for another 20 agonizing years. Decades crawled by. The 1950s turned into the 1960s, and then the 1970s. Humans conquered space, yet Onoda and Kazuka remained frozen in 1944, surviving on wild bananas and stolen cattle. But in 1972, during a raid on a local village, gunfire shattered the trees. Kazuka was shot and killed. Onoda was now entirely alone. For 2 years, he lived as a solitary ghost, sleeping with his hand wrapped around his rifle. Search parties found nothing. He was a myth that could not be caught. But the strangest part was still coming. In 1974, an eccentric college dropout named Norio Suzuki traveled to the island, determined to find the legendary ghost. Deep in the thick underbrush, Suzuki heard a rustle. He turned around only to find himself staring directly into the barrel of Onoda's rifle. Suzuki calmly begged for his life and explained the war was over. But Onoda's military conditioning was absolute. He made a terrifying declaration. He would only surrender if his original commanding officer from 1944 personally ordered him to. And this is where the story becomes unbelievable, because Suzuki was left with an impossible choice. Suzuki rushed back to Japan, tracked down Onoda's elderly commander, now a quiet bookseller, and dragged him back to the jungle. On March 11, 1974, The elderly commander read the official surrender orders in a clearing. Onoda stood frozen. The gun he had guarded for 10,672 days slipped from his hands. The devastating reality finally hit him. His friends had died for nothing, and 30 years of his life had been wasted on a war that had ended when he was a young man. Onoda collapsed to his knees, weeping uncontrollably as he surrendered his samurai sword. Onoda returned to a modern Japan he did not recognize. He couldn't cope with the neon lights and the fast-paced society. He was a living relic of a past his country wanted to forget. He had survived the jungle, but he would spend the rest of his life trying to survive the peace. What would you have done if you were in his shoes and suddenly realized the last 30 years of your life were based on a lie? Let me know in the comments. If this story amazed you, leave a like and subscribe for more unbelievable true stories from history. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in his shoes?